Hey guys, it's Mrs. Olenichek, and today we're going to talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Really, we're just going to cover the basics so that later when we start talking about the processes in more detail, you have somewhere to put that information. As usual, feel free to pause, rewind, fast forward, and write down any questions that you have, and be sure to ask about them in class. So here we go. Let's start out with cellular respiration, because that's the one you're probably most familiar with. Essentially, you're getting chemical energy, or ATP, out of your food. We need energy for things like building new materials for growth or repair, reproduction, active transport, movement, temperature control, maintaining your body temperature even though it changes around you. And organisms that need or depend on other organisms for their energy are called heterotrophs. We are an example of one of those heterotrophs. We are also known as consumers because we consume other organisms to get energy. What is energy in biology? Why, ATP, of course. ATP is kind of like a battery. A rechargeable battery. And so ATP carries around these little chunks of energy, and you release that energy by pulling off this last phosphate group. And when you do that, you release perfect little quantity of energy to get most reactions in your cells to occur. You're then left with this ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with two phosphates. And this inorganic phosphate. So you reattach this by putting some energy in or recharging your battery, and you have functional ATP. So harvesting energy stored in food. The process is called cellular respiration. And essentially that's just breaking down food to produce ATP. So using the energy stored in the bonds in your food to make ATP, which is more readily used right away. This happens in mitochondria. It uses oxygen, so if you want to be technical, it's going to be called aerobic cellular respiration. So anything that requires oxygen is aerobic. So in goes the food, in goes the oxygen, and out comes some ATP. Usually we talk about the food as being glucose, but you could also break down fats or even proteins if the cell was desperate. So here's the overall equation. You have glucose plus oxygen reacts to form energy plus carbon dioxide and water. And here is the balanced equation. Notice that the energy is in the form of ATP. So overall, everything happens in the mitochondria. The fuel is going to be the food, the sugar. The helpers here are oxygen, but you also have a bunch of enzymes involved, and those are going to be embedded in these membranes here. The products are ATP as well as carbon dioxide, which is then used by plants, and water. So we call what goes in the reactants oxygen and glucose, and the products are going to be carbon dioxide and water, and ATP, of course. Sorry about that. Mitochondria are everywhere. Please remember, mitochondria are in both plant cells and animal cells, and without them, plants would not make sugar. They don't make sugar just for us to eat. So mitochondria cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration, occurs in both plant and animal cells. So we can't really store ATP. It's not super stable. It's only used in the cell that produces it. And so it's short-term energy storage. Carbohydrates and fats would be more long-term energy storage. And so if you're looking at cells that tend to use a lot of energy, you're going to find that they have a lot of mitochondria. And here's that whole process for you again. That ATP is used to do work. It forms ADP and phosphate, and then you recycle it all over. A working muscle recycles over 10 million ATPs per second. So that's a lot of glucose and oxygen. But sometimes you run into a situation where there is no oxygen or there's not enough oxygen available. If there's no oxygen available, you can't complete aerobic respiration, and so you have something called anaerobic respiration, also known as fermentation. And there's two main types that we talk about. We have alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. And these are going to occur if there's no oxygen available or no mitochondria in bacteria. Since they don't have any membrane-bound organelles, they're unable to perform aerobic cellular respiration. The problem with this type of respiration, anaerobic respiration or fermentation, is that you can make very few ATP. So aerobic cellular respiration, you get 36 to 38 ATP per glucose, whereas in fermentation you get only 2. And so you can imagine larger animals don't do very well using anaerobic respiration. So alcohol fermentation occurs in yeast, and this is where they convert glucose to ATP, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. We use this to make beer, wine, and bread. So it all just depends where the sugars come from. And then lactic acid fermentation occurs in bacteria, and it also occurs in animals like you and me. And this is where you break down glucose to form ATP and lactic acid. Sometimes bacteria use this, and we take advantage of that to make yogurt. But you also, if you've ever felt muscle fatigue, when your muscles run out of available oxygen, they will start lactic acid fermentation. So now we move on to photosynthesis. And remember, this is just a quick overview so that you get the basics, so that later when we start talking about details, it's a little bit easier to understand. Photosynthesis, life from light. So plants are energy producers. Like animals, plants need energy to live. But unlike animals, plants don't need to eat other organisms in order to get that energy. They make both food and energy. We are considered consumers or heterotrophs, hetero meaning other, and plants, those are called producers or autotrophs. Plants use energy from the sun, and they use that energy to make ATP and something called NADPH. Then they use the energy stored in the ATP and NADPH to make sugars. Those sugars being glucose, sucrose, cellulose, starch, and other compounds made and used by plants. There's your NADPH. Photosynthesis really is broken down, like I said, into two separate processes. One is the energy building reactions, and these are also known as light dependent reactions. This is where energy from the sun is used to make ATP and something called NADPH, which is just an electron carrier. And then you have your sugar building reactions, also known as light independent reactions, where you take the energy stored in ATP and NADPH and you use it to build sugars. You also need carbon dioxide and water for this process. So where does all this happen? In the chloroplast. The reactants are going to be sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. You have enzymes involved. And the products are glucose and oxygen gas. So again, you have your energy building reactions, and you use that energy to build sugars. And sugars are kind of your longer term storage. And the process starts all over again. Remember, chloroplasts are only found in plant cells, so only plants have chloroplasts. They also have mitochondria though, so don't forget about that. Let's focus just a little bit on the structure of the chloroplasts. So the leaves of plants are kind of like the solar cell factories of plants, and this is where you're going to find high concentrations of chloroplasts. So chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, which is the pigment that we associate with them, the green stuff. And their job is to absorb sunlight and carbon dioxide, and they use that to make sugar. If we look at the structure of the chloroplast a little bit more closely, you'll notice it has a double membrane. The stroma is going to be the fluid-filled interior. The thylakoid are the individual sacs. When they come together, we call them grana or granum. So a whole bunch of thylakoids together make up a granum. And the thylakoid membranes actually have a whole bunch of chlorophyll embedded, and this is where we have something called an electron transport chain and ATP synthase. And so you'll notice here this ACE means that it's an enzyme, and if you look at it, we can probably figure out what it does. ATP synthase, so it's an enzyme that synthesizes or makes ATP. Chlorophyll, these are going to be embedded in that thylakoid membrane, and they get arranged in what we call a photosystem, which is just a collection of molecules that all work together. And these are really important for absorbing light. So this is where the whole process really starts. The chlorophyll absorbs certain wavelengths of light and gets excited and releases an electron, and then the whole process begins. It's important to understand how they work, and kind of to do that you should know a little bit about light. So we have the whole visible light spectrum. This is what we can see. This is the whole Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And those refer to the wavelengths of light. So not just the color, but the wavelength of light. And chlorophyll actually absorbs best at red and blue wavelengths of light, and least in green. So red or blue light would be really good for a plant, whereas green light would be terrible because it wouldn't get much out of it. What you see when you look at things is actually only the light that's going to be reflected. So it's kind of weird to think about, but something that's green is really absorbing all the wavelengths of visible light except green. So it's really everything but green. And so this is just showing you where these particular pigments absorb best. And you'll notice in this green range, very little absorption happens. So now we'll get to the connections. If we look at the equations for respiration and photosynthesis, you should notice that they are opposites. So the reactants of respiration are the same as the products of photosynthesis, and the reactants of photosynthesis are the same as the products of cellular respiration. The differences being the types of energy involved, but the whole point of photosynthesis is to convert light energy into chemical energy. Another way to look at it is that photosynthesis generates glucose and sugars. Cellular respiration, you get your ATP, your water and carbon dioxide as waste products. And here's another way to look at it. Photosynthesis, you capture light, synthesize organic molecules, oxygen is your waste, that gets digested in cellular respiration